Well, I mean, how important is that banter not only between the two of you, between songs, but also between the audience?
Well, it's crucial because otherwise you're going to a show to listen to 19 sad funeral dirges in a row.
It's like putting quarters in a jukebox,
not ever
right?
like in our band again.
Yeah, it would come across like putting quarters in a jukebox kind of thing instead of the real blossoming of watching two people on stage.
I think that's right, and I think that audiences, maybe these days, I guess we weren't there back in those days, but I think that audiences today are very generous in their attention span when it comes to going to a concert and standing for an hour and a half and enjoying somebody who either puts no effort or puts poor effort into doing anything other than playing their songs. And, not everybody's a natural born speaker or entertainer, and I understand that, sometimes that's just how it is. And, for instance, like, I remember a show I went to of Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers at Hollywood Bowl in 2008, I want to say, or 2009. And, man, they played for 2.5 hours, and Tom Petty didn't say a word, and that was fine, because as it turns out, the Tom Petty jukebox is kind of full of hit after hit.
Yeah.
And so that works pretty good. But I'd say otherwise, if you're coming to a Milk Carton Kids show, or you're coming to any show that's not that musically potent, or that, and when we're talking about Tom Petty, for all intents and purposes, it's rock and roll, but it's pop music. It's,
Yeah.
Those 3 minutes after 3 minutes have a lot of information that are doing a lot of things to your brain and a lot of things to your heart. If you're going to go sit down and watch a songwriter play for an hour and a half, that's demanding a lot of the audience to sit there and just listen to song after song. I feel like they're they don't necessarily have to be funny, or they don't have to do it in a style that resembles necessarily ours. But I feel like, if you go and see, it's a good example. If you go and see Chris Smither, like I did many times at McCabe's in Los Angeles, he plays a few songs and then he talks to you a little bit. Sometimes he makes you laugh. Sometimes he tells you a serious story that gives you some insight into his artistry. But, it's not just wall-to-wall music. You've got to break it up because the people sitting there deserve a little more than that.
Well, you ultimately...
hard-earned money.
Yeah, you ultimately, subconsciously or consciously want to have a conversation. Like, I think of, like, prime example of what you're talking about is Todd Snyder,
Sure.
I mean, that's literally like you're hanging out in his living room and he's talking to you,
That's right. And what a beautiful and strange and interesting experience that is, right?
Yeah.
That he can do that without us ever saying a word, that you can leave getting that impression. I mean, that's high art right there, in my opinion.
What do you think, what is it about the dynamic of two musicians and two acoustic guitars that appeals to you?
Well, in the beginning, it came, there were sort of equal parts motivation of we liked the sound, and we liked the added space, and we liked the realness of it. There was less pieces to put together to make it sound true, and that's really invigorating. And at the same time, there's a wonderful overlap there of financial motivation and being able to be streamlined. And for up until this last year, where we decided to make a record with a few more musicians for the first time, and then we took them on the road. Up until then, and that was, I think, 8 years. Joey and I could land in any city on earth with our guitars, and we could take a rickshaw to the show if we wanted to, and we wouldn't have to sacrifice anything. The people would get the full experience. And there's something also very intriguing about that nimbleness and that sort of accessibility, because it meant that there was equally nothing to hide behind, but also nothing to prop ourselves up on. We have to figure it out and figure out how to make it enjoyable and make it interesting, just with those simple tools. And I think that brought out a very unique part of our collaboration and of our writing and of our performing.
Well, what are you discovering about the guitar these days?
Everything, and it's partly because like I said, we've taken this band out with us, and when we come to Cold Mountain, we're going to have it's going to be a quartet. It's going to be Joey and I and bass and drums, and that'll be our first ever show. Is that we've had every time we've had bass and drums, we've always had a few other players also to help create the scene. But this show will be the first time we do that, and as we played with this band, there's been a few iterations of how many people have been in it. And to answer your question, every time the situation's different, I seem to learn something new on the guitar, because as that changes, the role of the guitar player in the band fundamentally changes. From when it's just two of us, I've got a lot of ground to cover, and sometimes it has to do with keeping the rhythmic engine going, and other times it has to do with trying to paint the colors on the wall so that the listener gets a little firmer sense of time and place. And sometimes the job is a strange combination of the two that I've never balanced before. And so now sort of shuffling around these extra players to help us perform some of the songs we wrote on this last album, that definition has sort of changed by day. And so it's always a discovery process, learning that, when you play in a band with one of the world's greatest upright bass players, sometimes you play the guitar a little bit less, and you figure out how to make as much an impact as you used to without playing as many notes. And so it's always a matter of discovery, but for me, it usually happens in the context of who I'm with and how to serve the greater idea of getting a song across to an audience. It's very seldom that you'll find me sitting with a guitar alone in a room, working too much out, because I find that all of the real work happens in the company of other people out in the real world, and to isolate yourself that way, it's a good practice to get better.
Yeah.
But it doesn't prepare you very much for when you're in the battle.
My last question is, what is the role of the songwriter and the role of the folk musician in the digital age?
Right. Well, I think that, like always, at a certain point, society will come along and decide either who has a greater purpose or who gets lucky that week. But I think the role always was to be true to your own voice, true to your own instinct. And if one's music is a thoughtful reflection of their essence and a thoughtful reflection of their personage, then what comes from that is a more relatable reflection of individuality.
Yeah.
So, I think the burden of humankind for all time has been misunderstanding, and has been a lack of empathy, and has been a lack of kindness and caring for your neighbor, and trying to understand that life is hard.
Yeah.
And we're all trying to get through it together. And so if you can make your case a little more pretty, a little more rhetorical, and have it carry a little more weight with your neighbor, then I feel like you have a better chance of getting through and connecting. And I feel like that's always been the role, is that you're just trying to do a little better at communicating, because anytime we all do that, it brings a little more humanity into the world. It brings a little more understanding. It brings a little more compassion for what, is hard for everyone. And so I think the job remains the same as it's always been, which is you sit down and you do the best to reflect who you are, and you hope that it resounds with people, because people are always looking for that.